Gifted education is inherently flawed. What it simply means is that we've stratified students according to what we believe their abilities are. One number to define a student, that isn't that useful at all. The simple answer is no. I think that it's incredibly intimidating to think that if you have 30 students in a classroom, that you have to give all 30 students your attention. The biggest myth about gifted education is that
Morgan, welcome to the International Classroom Podcast. Whereabouts in the world do we find you today?
So right now I'm in Vietnam. So I just moved to Vietnam this year after doing about a dozen years in the Middle East. And before that, I was in the UK and Canada. So I feel like I'm worthy of being part of an international podcast now. I'm fulfilling that. I'm so delighted to be here today.
I want to jump straight into this because obviously the focus of this a little bit is to do with evidence and research, but primarily we're going around this concept of gifted education, aren't we? And the question really to start with is, should we even be labeling students as gifted in the first place?
The simple answer is no. We shouldn't be labeling students as gifted. The word itself is meaningless. It's moot. Giftedness is a social construct. James Borland would say that it is something that has been invented, not discovered. So giftedness, even in the UK, has meant different things. Academics, they may argue over the definition of it. It's how we measure it so differently across countries, within countries. There are different tests that are used. All these things mean that you might be geographically gifted in one area, but not in another. Giftedness as a whole doesn't mean much when the variation is so wide. So the label doesn't really tell us much, but we are selecting students for special opportunities, for more resource allocation, for higher amounts of challenge in their learning based on a very convoluted, vague definition. So the label giftedness isn't something that's necessarily useful to us, or it doesn't serve a purpose.
So just for the premise of this conversation then, what should I be replacing, let's say, the traditional term of gifted? What should we replace them with?
That is a great question. Basically, because educators in different countries have tried to do exactly that. What can we say instead of gifted? And some places still use gifted quite explicitly. So if you go to the United States, very, very explicit gifted programs. This is a gifted and talented student. The students are labeled that based on a Wechsler IQ test or some version of a cognitive ability testing. So there are places that do use gifted. I think when we look at the British system, giftedness has kind of fallen out of favor. In about 1998, it was customary to say that these are our gifted and talented students. If you were to ask most teachers today, they would say giftedness, is that even still a thing? That's phased out. But instead, they've replaced it with terms like more able, high ability, significantly able, high aptitude. So they've just given it the same meaning, but under a different name. They've rebranded giftedness. What it simply means is that we've stratified students according to what we believe their abilities are, which can be quite dangerous to put students and label them sometimes at quite a young age into a certain box. Yep. So I'm not too interested in giftedness because some places use it, some places don't. But I am interested in the gifted paradigm because the gifted paradigm is one of ability. And ability is something that most teachers use every single day. And it can be a very, very inequitable lens to use when we're looking at teaching our students.
Canada, we've had this conversation before. I'm curious, whereabouts in Canada do you originate from?
So I was born in British Columbia, but lived in the Northwest Territories, Nova Scotia, Ontario. So I feel like I've crisscrossed across Canada too. But both my parents were educators. They were both teachers. So we got to teach in a lot of different contexts across Canada.
Generational. There we go. It's not very often you occasionally do, I suppose, but more often than not, it's, sometimes I have teachers and it's interesting. We had this conversation at the BSME in terms of work experience, and it's why aren't we getting students to do work experience as teachers? Because it's not very often we find that teachers then have generational, occasionally we do, But I think it's more of maybe a US, a Canada thing, not maybe across Europe, that you see, like for me as a teacher, that my children would want to be teachers. I don't know. I love it. I kind of love that fact that you've gone into the family profession, as it were. So obviously from Canada, we crisscrossed across. What is it that originally brought you out to the Middle East?
I think actually the British system. So I taught in the UK, and the rigor of it amazed me, but I was amazed at the teacher burnout. I thought that it didn't quite align, to be honest, with a lot of the values that I held when I was teaching in Canada. And I saw what it was doing. I was Ofsteded the last year that I was there, and I really wanted a new adventure and to see what else was out there. I taught in the Canadian system. The British system, in terms of the children, in terms of the curriculum, was really, really fascinating. But I think that it is really, really hard to teach in the UK for an extended period of time without getting really, really frustrated. And I think my book kind of speaks to that, about the idea of social immobility that can be perpetrated.
There we go. See? What you don't realize is, everyone, because I'll edit this out, is that when I tried to say the word originally in terms of perpetuated, I couldn't do it first time around, could I? So it's infectious.
Please edit it out for me too.
I can do that. I can try. But I've been honest now. I've been honest and said to people, look, it's my fault. Don't blame Morgan. We've got to save all the good words for a little bit anyway. Yeah, because you mentioned in there, and again, from the Middle East, both experience here in terms of how we identify them. And we may have students within our classes that have a generic CAT4 score that on average, as a mean, is exceptionally high. And then you will have other ones that are part of your high ability, gifted and talented program, or identification of those things that aren't necessarily then fit for your subject. So obviously you address this in the book, but what are some of the biggest flaws that you're finding in the ways that we currently identify and support, I'm going to use the word gifted, but these gifted students?
So I think that what we have is the identification knot. How you identify students for all these programs, the simple answer would be we don't identify them at all. We need to know our students without pigeonholing them. And when we look at giftedness, there is this tendency to use something as simple as a cognitive ability test score to say that this student is universally advanced, when in fact it's more useful to look at domain specificity. So subject domain specialism can be really, really powerful if we're looking at extending a student to a certain topic or subject. When we look at something like a cognitive ability test score, we tend to see all of these scores lined up really, really neatly so that we know from top to bottom how our students are, their potential. What's really interesting about that data point is that it is just one data point, and we collect thousands of data points every single day. That standardized test score usually means that we're looking at different batteries. What's more interesting is what's happening between the batteries. So for instance, if they have a high verbal score and a low nonverbal score, that tells us something really interesting that will change our teaching strategy. But a simple standardized assessment score, one number to define a student, that isn't that useful at all. And I think what's more useful that we use in our teaching and learning every single day is not so much a cognitive ability score that tells us what their potential might be, but instead it's how they are currently attaining in that topic at that time. That's what's really interesting. What their current attainment in is the most important thing that I as a teacher need to know in order to help that student progress. I always use the example of geography. So I teach geography, which has both physical and human geography. And sometimes I have students that do so well because they love earthquakes and volcanoes. And so they go off the charts when they're interested and motivated and understand physical geography. But then when it comes to the essay writing and the gray areas of human geography, such as looking at migration patterns, they don't do as well. So a simple score doesn't tell me that much about how I can help that student progress in my subject. I've got to do something different, and that means kind of adapting and making sure that I'm helping them in the moment with what they need.
Yeah, anyone listening to that might just go, that just sounds like good teaching, Morgan, in terms of we knowing our students and therefore being able to adapt or differentiate, whichever the terminology you want to use is, to their potential struggle areas, or how do you basically go about using their strengths to make them stronger in certain things? So, it sounds almost like then that the concept and rationale for gifted education or higher ability education is somewhat flawed. So therefore, should we just get rid of it altogether and just actually focus on being outstanding teachers?
Yeah, exactly. Gifted education is inherently flawed. There's a few reasons that it's flawed. It's really fascinating why we think we needed it to begin with. And I talk about the gifted paradigm as something where we talk about ability a lot. And we tend to think that a student is more able because they're born that way. We don't tend to think that students are more able when they have more access to resources. They are more able because they speak the language. They are more able because they have parents that are able to support them in different ways. They are more able because they have more opportunities for enrichment after school. So all these things can contribute to more ableness, giftedness, being seen as high attaining or high ability. There are so many things that are kind of societally surrounding this idea of giftedness. And it's a real shame that we kind of take away this lens that we could be wearing to make learning easier for our students by removing those barriers.
So let's think about those barriers then, because one of the things that you do talk about is challenge for all. And obviously, we're talking about then replacing and putting in what we're just going to call just good teaching, just great teaching. But what does that actually look like in practice?
I think there's a few things that are happening where we see great teaching as being taken to the next level because there's been an emphasis on adaptive, personalized, and responsive teaching. I think it used to be I would walk into a classroom, and if I was going to set up my lesson plan for the day, I would seat my students according to their neatly defined low, high, and middle ability groups. I would have different differentiated tasks for each of those groups. And by doing that, I would put a cap on some of those groups' learning. So all students can, most students can, some student can learning objectives. These have mostly gone by the wayside, although I still see those kind of traffic light systems being used. We don't want to put students in a position where we expect less from them. So adaptive teaching is really about having one high bar and having scaffolds available and allowing students to struggle and then giving them what they need in that moment to reach that one high learning intention. And that's what's really powerful, that we do have expectations. It doesn't mean that we don't group students. It's really powerful to do some formative assessment, ask some hinged questions, and then do small group learning to close those gaps in understanding or prior knowledge. We have flexible groupings where students are always being moved around. We are able to, in the moment, decide what type of scaffold a student might need, or if that scaffold is simply something like confidence or emotional rapport that you need to give. So great teaching just simply means being present. It doesn't mean creating a stack of mini lessons within lessons to prove that you know your students. Instead, you are simply there for them and have that energy to give them what they need in that moment to progress.
See, when you say it like that, it sounds really easy, and it sounds pretty straightforward. However, we know it's not happening. We know that this isn't, and I'm kind of curious from what you've researched and what you've seen, like what's actually stopping teachers from achieving this?
I think that it's incredibly intimidating to think that if you have 30 students in a classroom, that you have to give all 30 students your attention. There's something really scary about the fact that you might have one student that is so far behind that you're going to spend the entire lesson step by step guiding a student through something that all the other students have covered, and then they're waiting to be instructed as to what to do next. And I think the idea that we have so much content to cover that can actually hold teachers back. Well, we got to move forwards. That means that this student will fall further and further behind because we're allowing those gaps in knowledge to increase. So this pressure to cover content, this idea that we won't be able to give these students what they need to progress, There's a few ways out of that. And it simply means that we might need to tweak our curriculum, that we allow more opportunities for depth over breadth, that we do allow for that kind of mastery learning, that we do maintain those high bars, because we do see countries like Germany, France, Switzerland, and Japan, where the idea that students all meet a certain criteria before everyone moves on, that's just normalized. And it's not a scary thing. I think overarching challenge can be really key. We want to make sure that we provide opportunities for students to explore beyond that immediate learning intention so that they can move forward with something with curiosity and exploration. They can dig deep in those moments. And that's what real extension looks like. It's not giving them one more additive extension task. It used to be that we would just performance punish students if they were working fast ahead, and we would give them one more thing to do. We need to give opportunities that open up their eyes and give them a lot of student choice and voice. For those students that we worry are falling behind, we are at the precipice of one of the greatest revolutions in education because we have adaptive software. Software where we can allow a student to be asked a question. They can be assessed quickly and say, no, that's the wrong answer. Read this, go back, try this. You got it. Let's try a harder one, and backwards and forwards. So there's more opportunities to help a student move through a series of questions and find those gaps really quickly. The fact that we have that now is really special. It helps students learn at different rates, all of the same classroom. So the fact that we can give more extension and opportunities for depth, while at the same time making sure that we can close gaps, do those small group work, give students software that will help them succeed. We're at a really exciting point in education where teaching in a multi-ability classroom is more interesting and exciting and funner than ever.
Yeah, and obviously research that supports this concept of heterogeneous or mixed ability classrooms in comparison to grouping them. And obviously from my side, science teacher, I've been in schools where students have been set. I've been in schools where they haven't been set and it's remained mixed. But focusing on that, does that then mean that we should just get rid of ability grouping altogether? And then on the same side, and this is really where the question goes, if everyone is in the same class, does the water down expectations for top performing students, like, are we then going to be watering down? Because that's the concern. If we mix everyone up, how do we maintain this high bar? If everyone's the same, do expectations decrease?
It's actually the opposite. Expectations increase for all. Fascinating, because I think that ability grouping is something that we should be doing in classes all the time. We're mixing up groups. We're saying you're attaining this, you're having trouble with this. If we're constantly moving those students around, we're giving lots and lots of opportunity within a class for students to learn from each other, to grow. That is really important. I think when we think of ability grouping in the UK, for instance, we immediately think of setting, where we look at sets of students that are taking a test at the beginning of the year, and they're put in these rigid sets. And students know when they are in a low ability set. They also know when they are in the top set. And you can just imagine emotionally what that feels like for a student. And that's where we see a lot of students who feel like they have been placed in a place where they can't move forward. Low expectations are so low for them. And they get really disaffected that they can ever progress. At the same time, you have students in the top set who feel incredible anxiety and pressure to succeed. There's a feeling of imposter syndrome. There are those who want to drop down so they can work at a pace that they're more comfortable with. In fact, when we look at research, let's say William Bowler and Brown did a longitudinal study, 6 years of mathematics in the UK, and they found that overall, students were unhappy with it, and they did not make the progress that was expected. And this is also seen in the Education Endowment Fund, which strongly recommends that schools do not set, that it is something that actually has a huge impact in holding back marginalized communities, summer-born children, low-income families. They tend to be set, and this actually slows their progress, and it slows it for quite a long time. We can't just set in English, math, and sciences, because schools are ecosystems, and that has this knock-on effect. I have been the geography teacher where all of a sudden my lovely heterogeneous classes, those are then set by science. And I have these set classes where I notice a complete difference. and the feeling of the activities that I can do in the class to help these students. When
So,
we look in the US, sorry.
No, you carry on. Please carry on.
I was just thinking, so in the US, they have gifted classes that are just for specific gifted students, but they also have something called tracks. So tracks would mean that right when I enter high school, I'm put in one track where there's a completely separate curriculum for me based on what my abilities are. So that might be an applied track, or it could be that you're streamed into an academic track. So one would be for more trade, one would be for more university. That would basically be two curriculum pathways where it's really, really hard to then move up a pathway. So right away, very early on, you are actually capping what a student can do with their education. And that's quite scary, especially when you see that aligns so much with social immobility patterns, where those students who are of a certain socioeconomic status are consistently put in applied tracks. So we see it all over the world, Australia, Canada, the US, the UK, the same outcome. There might be small marginal gains for those top set or highest attaining students, but then overall, all of the rest of the students, the outcomes are lower. But we consistently continue to set students like it is doing some good, which is really fascinating.
Yeah. So we want to dive into then strategies and ways in which teachers can, within a mixed ability class, go about maintaining, these high bars and high expectations. And one of the things I know that you're really keen on, and I've heard a lot of people talk about this, and I think it's one of those words that has always been there and it's gaining traction, as in more people are now aware of it and seeing the importance of it, and that is Oracy. And I'm curious then from it, obviously you're a big fan of this, and there's something in there where you mentioned about Harkness tables. Just so we can get a clarity on this, because you might say to a certain generation about Harkness and they're going to go for the Marvel, and I don't know if you're a fan of this on Disney, there's Agatha Harkness. This is just me loving comics and stuff, but there is actually something genuine about it. Like what is a Harkness table first and foremost?
I do love Oracy. I think Oracy is one of those things that's exploded right now in a really wonderful way. Harkness is a kind of variation on Oracy. Harkness was originally set up in Philip Exeter in the US about 120 years ago, with the idea that education needed to be revolutionized. That instead of having students who are lectured at sitting at desks in a row, diligently taking notes, instead they would be sitting around a table and the teacher would be a facilitator while students would basically lead the discussion after having gone through a series of prompts and prepared themselves to engage in the material. That instead of the teacher telling them what to think, they would be able to come to their own conclusions and to vigorously defend their positions or have the ability to change their mind. Harkness is really, really fascinating because the table itself is supposed to be seen as an equalizer, where everyone has an equal place at that table and can look each other in the eyes and exchange ideas. Harkness is hard to do, but the payoff is incredible.
Yeah, because I would say that leads nice into certain strategies. So one of the ways in which we can therefore, and again, talk about how do we bring in, mixing abilities, but also maintaining rigor. And I'm curious from the research and what you found, is like, what do schools and teachers get wrong about rigor?
That is really interesting. I think that with rigor, it's different than degree of difficulty. Degree of difficulty is we want those students to struggle with material in order to learn. Rigor is something else. Rigor is something that we are saying we are assessing this using a standardized assessment, and they're going to have to reach these certain points. It doesn't necessarily mean that students are learning or that their skills are necessarily developing, but they might be getting better at taking a certain test about a very, very specific topic. When we take a look at how students are learning, we want them to struggle as much as possible. We want them to have hard thinking that's happening. A lot of the times this means giving them metacognition and self-regulation techniques so they are more aware of their learning pattern. And that's what's really powerful. That's what we want when we talk about rigor. We want them to rigorously apply themselves. What I always go back to is Michael Young's idea of powerful knowledge. the idea that when we first have knowledge, it should be really organized into, let's say, disciplinary language, that it's really systematic and the way that we can actually work out schemas. The second thing that we want to have is we want to make sure that you can understand something beyond your immediate experience. So I can understand osmosis without being able to look at it. And then the third thing is this idea that you should be able to challenge assumptions and confront complexity in the world. And those are three things that I think are more apt when we talk about the idea of rigor. But only some of that would you be able to find on an exam. We want our students to be able to do those three things. And I think that's a really powerful way to look at how our students can move forward.
And there'll be teachers listening to this and watching this that then go, yeah, but I'm really concerned because that sounds like it's just going to overwhelm the little Jimmy or, you know, the little Jenny that's in my class. You know, I'm going to have to lower the challenge. You know, what do you say to that? How do we ensure that these struggling students don't feel overwhelmed whilst also stretching their abilities?
Students should be overwhelmed.
There's a sound bite right there.
Students should be overwhelmed, and they should be overwhelmed with something of their choice. One of the things that we can do to build up overarching challenge is we have to find those magical moments where students can put themselves into the curriculum. One of the things that I really encourage is project-based learning with student choice. So this allows students to pick a project and to dive deep. This means that they are learning how to create a research question, learning how to solve problems, learning to interrogate media and resources, learning how to analyze something, whether that's right or wrong, if it comes to a conclusion they want or not. We are teaching them how to investigate. And when they're really, really passionate about something, the results are incredible. I have seen year 7 students that have stood up in front of an auditorium and been able to explain string theory with the adroitness that I would expect a third year graduate from university to do. These are students that once you take the lid off and you find something that they're passionate about, they really can explore and show off. I think that we've all seen those kids that want to do more on space and dinosaurs, and we don't have it in our curriculum, but that's desperately something they want to explore. Give students the opportunities to go beyond and bake in those opportunities, and you'll be amazed at what comes out of it. We want students to be overwhelmed because they're choosing something and they're so excited about it. It becomes so big, and then they have to narrow down what they are specifically interested in. Yeah. There's lots of opportunity there.
It sounds, if I just summarize, like intellectual risk taking, like to pull a few things together is very much there, which I'm going to give you in terms of, in theory, sounds great. But I might be someone at school and I might be like, oh, but I've got assessment point or I've got data point, so I've got to be doing all this. It's like I've got a lot of content, I've got curriculum that I need to cover, you know. But we're now turning, you're starting to see it and you're hearing a lot more people talk about this. And we're seeing schools in the UK that are dropping GCSEs, or not all of them, but some of them, and giving this time, this opportunity. Like, how do schools go about creating a culture where students can embrace this struggle as part of their learning and kind of move beyond grades?
I think that's a great question. I think our curriculums have got to change. There's so many things that we can do with curriculum that's really important. Key Stage 3 is the part of curriculum when we look at British systems that can really be a place that's the engine of the school, and that's where you can really have fun. When we get into exam classes, the curriculum is more prescribed. We have to kind of make our way through that content so that students can feel like they can do well and succeed. But I think it's really interesting, though. I've done things at school like we have enrichment projects where every single department puts together an open-ended question around a theme that allows students to explore deeper. So instead of, let's say, doing one add-on extension question in a lesson, you have a larger project that you're building over an entire year that allows you to really get in depth and explore something that you're interested in. So that's one way to make space for and create those opportunities. I think when we take a look at our curriculum as a whole, we want to make sure that it's open, decolonized, diverse, culturally responsive, all those things that can make it more interesting for students, which is a really hard ask on top of saying we want a high degree of difficulty and challenge. It might mean that we take a look at our curriculum and say, well, is this suited for our purpose? And I've seen schools do that, kind of rework to make sure that they are trying to fit less in so that opportunities for depth and research are really what we are giving our students.
I like that. And we're thinking of doing something similar at the moment. And we have capacity within our timetable, and especially with more of the sixth form. And we're trying to figure out what best suits them in terms of our enrichment program. Should we bring in our own and like curriculum type of thing that allows the opportunity to develop these skills that we used to think sat underneath the curriculum? And I think now we need to view it as sitting alongside it, if not on top of it. I think of it very biologically in terms of like epigenetics, in terms of, you know, you've got your DNA and that's your curriculum, but there are things that sit within it and sit on top of it that, although you don't necessarily inherit those, like it has a massive impact on what you inherit and the characteristics you come out with. Sorry, dropping science-wise there. But I see it like that in terms of, I think Charlie posted something on LinkedIn the other day, and we spoke about this in terms of viewing curriculums as a helix and how they interweave with each other versus on skills and knowledge, and even bringing a third component in now that we have like all these, and you could have it whatever suits the context of your schools, be it skills, be it knowledge, enrichment, empathy, values. AI could be one, but it's just a nice way to view it. And what you've said there is about how it's interwoven and how we perceive these values and weave it into what we want our students to do beyond grades. And that allows, I think, just that depth, breadth, challenge, all the things we want for them. Struggle especially. And struggle, I think, it's great to talk about it because, again, in one of those things, it sounds, when we talk about it, it sounds easy. And yet we know that there will continually be a difference and a differentiation of expectations within groups, a differentiation of expectations of what students should be able to come out with, especially as we move forward now into exam season. We have students preparing for GCSEs, we have students preparing for A-levels, and this concept of expectation almost, the heretic in me is going to ask, like, should we lower expectations for struggling students to prevent discouragement? And again, we talk about engagement. We talk about wanting students to stay in school. We talk about being able to have agency. If I continue to have a bar that's too high for a student, will I discourage them and put them off learning within my subject?
I think we discourage students when we put the bar too low, because then we say, this is all I think you are possible of. So when we set the bar too low, students get that. There's been studies done by Good and Brophy that found that low expectation students, they felt disaffected, and teachers also spent less time with them. There's kind of a cycle that happens when we have low expectations for our students. There's something that's really exciting when you talk to your class and you say, wow, you've just done a year 11 GCSE style answer when you did that there. And they get all excited. Yeah. When you set the bar high and you say, I didn't think that you guys would be able to handle that. Do you want to try something else? There's an enthusiasm and kids pick up on that. When you have high expectations, students want to go beyond that. And I think we've all had that moment in our own educational journeys where we've had someone believe in us. And that's why we did something differently or tried harder or tried it again or got more interested. It motivates us and moves us forward. The inner worlds of students are really complex, and having someone believe in you and not lower the bar, but instead give you the next thing that you need to get on that journey, that gives you the scaffold that rises you up, not takes you down. We don't dilute or make something easier or more palatable. We don't simplify. Instead, we ask our students to do something harder, and then we sit back amazed when they love it.
Before we move on, because I just want to pack that a little bit further, before we move on to the quick fire, scaffolding. I know you mentioned it earlier, like there's the adaptive, and I know you've written some wonderful pieces that are out there on social media and the internet for the world to read. But I think it is one of the areas that teachers struggle with because they don't understand what it actually is. So whilst I've got you here with your amazing insight and intellectual knowledge about this, If you were to just sort of simplify it for us, what would you say? What would you say is that scaffolding is?
I'll start with this. Scaffolding is meant to be taken away. And that is something that's so important. If we're building a huge building and we are using scaffolds, eventually we want that building to stand by itself, and that scaffold is taken away. And we only use it for when we're building those parts of the building. So when we think about scaffolds, we have to think about what can stand alone already. And a lot of the times when we think about scaffolds, we narrow them. So we think that we're designing a scaffold for one student, or let's say this archetype of a student. One of the things that I learned at my current school when I'm looking at English second language speakers is that I'm designing a scaffold and I'm putting it out for those students. What I'm not realizing is that there are a lot of students who haven't identified as English second language learners who still have massive gaps in understanding who could also utilize that scaffold. At the same time, there are students who absolutely don't need that scaffold. And this is actually taking away from their struggle, which they need in order to really do that hard thinking and learn. So scaffolds are useful, but we have to just let students struggle first before we just give away too much, which is really hard for teachers because we know the answer and we want to help as much as possible. But watching them struggle and then having a scaffold there, that is the most important part of adaptive teaching that we can do. And I was reminded of this the other day, that sometimes the most important scaffold is not one that I have prepared as a resource ahead of time. It is a scaffold that I give when I sit down and I talk to a student and I ask them what they're struggling with. And then I can give them just enough verbally to move on. Sometimes it's just a vote of confidence or gentle encouragement that takes them to the place where they need to be, not me giving them a simplified fill in the blank or connect these dots matching words. That's not where learning is going to happen. So scaffolds are not simple. They're actually really complex, and there's something that you will take away so that students are constantly practicing without it as well.
Okay. So I've listened to that. I understand it. The key thing I've taken away is that thinking should be hard. I can agree with that. And I've got a clear understanding that scaffolding is, like I picture the building. I can make that concrete in my head, can picture the building of what can stand alone already, but I want to take it higher. Like we're talking about hiring this bar. The challenge I have now is that I understand what a scaffold is. I understand that I want thinking to be hard, but I actually don't know how to go about scaffolding tasks or activities, in a pre-prepared way. What would be your, let's say, maybe top piece or top 3 things to help me and support me as an educator that would allow me to then create scaffolds for activities with students?
Well, scaffolds are interesting because it's basically looking at schemas of knowledge that students have built up. And formative assessment is one of the ways that we are constantly seeing what's missing in the schema. We need all these building blocks of knowledge to get somewhere. So having formative assessment, knowing that we're constantly retrieving that knowledge to build up those schemas, students are constantly making those connections, having those building blocks there so they can get higher and higher is really, really key. So we look at scaffolds. One of the things that we're doing is, well, what do they remember from last lesson, from last month, from last year that I can build on so that they have a better understanding? We're also asking students a lot of the times to do abstraction. So they can take ideas from one place and apply it in the other. We're asking them to elaborate on something so they can define it for themselves. All these things that we can do in the moment, or we can challenge them to take knowledge and then apply it in a different context, can be really powerful. When we take a look at problem-based learning, when we look at real-world application, so if I was to do a real-world application where students have to solve an issue in global warming by pretending they are drafting a policy document for the United Nations, that's really useful because they can build up what they have and fill in the blanks. And then I can give them scaffolds like the hints of the structures of the UN. So when we take a look at schema building, that gives us a really, really great idea of the missing pieces in where our students might need more help. And that gives us a direction to go in scaffolding.
Now, you've mentioned a word there several times, schema. For those of us who maybe haven't come across that, maybe don't know what it is, when you're using that word schema, what does that mean?
Schema is fascinating. It's the idea of having little bits of knowledge. So these little bits of knowledge, so whether if it was history, for instance, if we know the year that something happened and the people that were there and the institutions that existed and the food that was available, and we have all these little bits of knowledge, and then we have this picture that becomes clearer and clearer of what life was like there. And then we know what motivates people or why decisions were made, and we can then analyze, let's say, a historical source, because we know the context from all of these little bits of knowledge, to let us have a skill where we can actually fill in the blanks. So schema is little bits of knowledge that all of a sudden we start to have a clearer and clearer understanding of a larger topic or idea or concept. So building up a schema means using lots of knowledge first, and then from there we can do more interesting things. Whether that's analyze, explain, describe, connect, create, all those lovely things as we move up Bloom's taxonomy. But there's a reason why knowledge building is the most important part. I really like when we talked about curriculum before, I think it's a Christine Council's idea that we are reading a novel. I could summarize a novel like Pride and Prejudice in 5 sentences, just the main plot points. But it's the idea and detail of themes and character building over and arcs over a long time that give me a fuller picture of what's happening in that beautiful novel.
So it's a way in which we can understand, I've written this down, understand and categorize pieces of information. So, I always associate it with a tree, or I like the philosophical approach of the man in the monochrome box, if you ever come across this one. So in philosophy, there's a story of the man in the monochrome box, but he has books, and in those books, he can learn everything he needs to know about color. So he's there and he's learning and he knows everything about color. And one day he's released from the box and he sees the sky for the first time. But he doesn't know what color it is. And he sees the grass for the first time, but he doesn't know what color it is. And it's like this organization and structure way of one, but there's then with that, the experiential, you have to see it and be able to experience and touch, and how you therefore, like you say, interact and structure and categorize. And it kind of, I think about that one because I think of it in terms of a silo. And I think what we're getting to with this and how I view curriculums as well, and we talk about a lot about it, is that subjects are very siloed. So therefore we only organize our schemas and our places like, right, this is biology and biology goes this way. But the reality is, if you and I sat down together as a biologist and a geographer and we were developing a curriculum, all of a sudden it's like, hey, this interdisciplinary or cross-siloed approach, well, I can take this and then I have yours, and all of a sudden we want to build connections, and we have this mental model or mental map, and we're transferring information and skills. And that, in a way, I think also, in my opinion, alludes to how teachers are trained and how teachers understand other subject curriculums. That if we do want to stretch and challenge and raise the bar for students, it isn't just about, hey, we can go really deep. It's also, actually, let's go really far and wide. Let's have breadth, and let's talk about this in a geography sense. Like, I'm teaching earth science to year 8s, and one of the things that comes up, weathering. And I'm like, okay, let's see where we can take this into a different subject. And the kid's like, oh yeah, all of it. And that engagement and enthusiasm really comes into it, because like, we've done this in this subject, because in their minds, biology is biology and you only teach science, sir. And then miss, you only teach geography, and there's no crossover between you. So therefore I don't think about this when I go to there. And that for me is also one of the limitations of how we stretch and challenge and strive for, obviously, breadth and depth in across all these subjects. Is we need to open the doors for interdisciplinary or cross-siloed, and therefore teachers need to be more aware of what other teachers are doing so they can bring in these concepts and bring in that challenge. And I guarantee if you brought it in and go, oh, by the way, I know what you've been doing, Miss Whitfield, and you've done this, this, and this, so let's bring this in. And the kids will just be like, what? I know for a fact, but that's, for me, that's the type of thinking that I want students to get to. That's the type of curriculum design that I want to be able to get to with the students, especially year 7, 8s, and 9s, where, they are that year group that has no stress, no pressure, because there's no exams. And yet, if we get 7, 8, and 9 right, imagine the type of GCSE students you'd have. Imagine the type of A-level students you'd have. And then what they would go on to do. I think I get very excited about it, the same way you got excited talking about schemas, probably.
Oh, I think it's really fascinating. We do have such opportunity to explore in Key Stage 3, those years 7, 8, and 9 students. Those students who are really interested in all of a sudden where science meets geography, and they're looking at terraformation on Mars, and they need both disciplines to really explore it. I think interdisciplinary collaborations are really, really powerful. I think when I look at curriculum, there's this temptation to see it as, well, I learned this in year 7 and I build upon it in year 8, and then I do this in year 10, so I can do this at A level. And it seems like it's this straightforward mountain that students are climbing until they reach a peak and they take their final exams, which says what they're doing. And I like to think that instead we should really see curriculum as an ocean instead of a mountain. So there's lots of different ways that we can go, and we can stay close to shore, but at different points we can drop down to a completely different world that's unknown and in the depth that students can explore. And I think that's really, really powerful, because knowledge is like that. It is completely built up. It is never ending. There are so many directions that we can go, so many coastlines that we can visit, but then we can also do depth studies. So whether that may be looking at mathematics and history, looking at the Enigma code, there are lots of places where we need an interdisciplinary approach, and we need the opportunity to go in depth to understand something in so many different ways and levels. And that makes an even more complex, interlinked, and fantastic schema that we're building.
And also, I'll pose this one because I'm interested in your take on this. So we had the BSME Leadership Conference took place last weekend in Abu Dhabi. And obviously thinking about education for the future, but obviously curriculum comes up a lot within this. And GCSEs are obviously discussed, as we mentioned. And readiness is quite an interesting one, that we, like you say there, like year 7 is this, and we don't go above and beyond that. And year 8 is this, and we don't go above and beyond that. And yet, actually, it would be very interesting, and this is where, again, interest in your viewpoint, is if we just remove those, like who says that students have to take, if they did take GCSEs, who said they would have to take them at 16? What if a student's ready to take them before that? Or what if a student needs longer time before that? Like, what's your viewpoint on that? Like, I know it's a big conversation about assessments and exams, but do you think that if a student's ready for it and they're younger, should they be allowed to do it if they've embraced that curriculum?
Yeah, there's all kinds of ways to do that. There's grade telescoping, there's curriculum compacting, there's acceleration. I think that it's highly unusual actually in the British system that there is such rigidity, and the way that this is your group, this is what you're expected to know at this age, and you can't move up and down. I guess coming from Canada, one of the things that I was able to do is I could take a year 10 algebra course when I was in year 9. And I loved that. Then I could drop down and take a creative writing course that was for a grade 10 student when I was in grade 13. And I loved that I was able to go back and forth. And many students did. And we had a much more modularized system where you'd have 3 terms during a year and you could explore something in depth. So you might explore the African diaspora, and then you might be looking at an in-depth reading of Maya Angelou over one course. So there's so many opportunities to set up a curriculum that's different. But I think in the UK system, it is very rigid. And there's not as much movement between years. And that's really funny because age really doesn't mean that much when it comes to our interests. And when we take a look at giftedness in particular, there's such this emphasis that's put on precocity. So how fast you can absorb something in terms of knowledge and moving along. And there's this idea that the faster you learn something or move ahead, the better you are. Even though studies have shown that doesn't really make a difference when we come to adulthood. It's how we enjoy and learn skills along the way. So the British curriculum is actually quite unusual in the fact that there isn't as much capacity for students to move forward and do exams earlier or later. They are done when they are done. And having a more flexible system would definitely serve so many students so much better.
Yeah, that is a big conversation, probably best for another day, but and one that will be ongoing, I think, in terms of what we do in the future, and especially international schools. I think there's a lot of interest in what we can remove potentially and how we can be fit for purpose for the students and the world they are moving into. But as I say, big conversation for another day. For now, obviously, I want to move into this quick fire round for you because I obviously know you've got, we're busy as well. So yeah, I can hear the shuffling there. You've prepared, Morgan. I like this.
I know. I'm just like, you give me the questions, but I'm like, what were they?
All right. So first one, the biggest myth about gifted education.
The biggest myth about gifted education is that gifted education doesn't exist, when in fact, it is the entire paradigm of many educational systems. It is how we have structured our curriculum, our data systems within schools. Gifted education and ability thinking is very much ingrained, and it's really dangerous because it works against equity. So gifted education is a part of your system, even if you don't see it under that gifted name.
Fantastic. Right, next one. If you could redesign the school system overnight, what is the first thing you would change?
I would get rid of standardized assessments. I think that they are pretty useless. I think that we need a lot more freedom in designing our curriculums, making us use standardized assessments to force one very narrow set of curriculum, saying that this is the canon that needs to be done or completed by this age is quite dangerous. We aren't ensuring learning by having them. And in fact, we can actually bring students backwards and bring teachers pedagogically backwards by insisting upon it. So I find it really, really a great way to kind of start over would be to say, we're not going to do that. We're going to look more at what our students' needs are. And one of the things that I'd say I put in front of that is this idea of equity first in everything.
Amazing. I like that. I'm just letting that sink in. I like that one. All right. Third one. The worst advice you hear given to new teachers.
Oh, watch what I do. I think watch what I do and say, like, come watch me. It's just ripe for lethal mutations, as opposed to having teachers experiment and do things themselves, or saying, here's a bunch of PowerPoints, here are the lessons, crack on with it. It's really dangerous. That's not how new teachers learn and what they really need. So yeah, I think teachers, we need to have the deep struggle too, but also don't mimic necessarily what you see. Understand what you want to do.
Yeah. Come pick up my bad habits. You'll be fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Of which there are many, I tell you that. All right, last one. A thinker or educator that has influenced your philosophy the most.
Okay, this is really hard because there are a few of them. So when I was researching for the book, there was a bunch of educators in gifted education. And I think that they're probably less known. But Dr. James Borland, huge influence. Sally Reese and Joseph Renzulli. In terms of equity, Geneva Gay. In terms of educators that have made a huge difference in my life, Kate Jones. Kate Jones actually got me writing and got me thinking so that I would dig deeper. And she's just, Kate, she's really, really wonderful at encouraging others around her to do their own research and to fall in love with pedagogy all over again, to truly, truly embrace teaching and learning. So really great educators that I've read and learned from, and then an educator and a friend who I have learned so much from.
Some great names in there. Thank you for sharing those. And that's it. That is our episode. It's been fantastic, Morgan. I think I could probably sit and question you for a long, long time and just by osmosis, absorb all that knowledge and insight that you've got on all things teaching and learning. And there's so much good and so many golden bits of information in this conversation. From my side, I'm always very fortunate podcast now I get to speak to people as you do, and I kind of use it as my own professional development, and I just get to sit and ask the questions and scribble notes and learn from things. But if you were to say, like, take one thing that you could do tomorrow to make your classroom more inclusive and challenging for all, what would that one thing be that you would be saying to teachers?
If you want to make your classroom more inclusive and challenging, the number one thing that you could do is take away the word ability. So excise ability from your vocabulary. Think instead of a capacity that you can build within students. Think of the barriers that might exist that you can take away. I think the word ability is automatically limiting. So when you remove that, think about what you replace it with. You're talking about what a student is currently attaining. You think about what they are capable of and how you can give them what they need to get there. So I think that would be a powerful thing that you could implement tomorrow and then just see what your brain fills it with if you're wearing a new lens.
I like that. I'm just jotting that down in terms of, because I always think about performance. I think mine is given by performance, and performance is, for me, is consistency of, and it's not always based on ability necessarily. It's that capacity to at a certain time. And I like that word currently. I really, really like that in terms of where you're currently at and what I need to give you to get above that or beyond that or maintain that. I think is wonderful, wonderful, wonderful takeaway. Morgan, it's been an absolute pleasure. It is always an absolute pleasure to speak with you and to learn from you. Really appreciate your time that you've given us today and just sharing that knowledge and expertise. Lastly, if people want to find you, if people want to learn more about what it is that you're doing and reach out, where are the best places that they can find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. So Morgan Whitfield on LinkedIn. You can read my book. It's available on Amazon. And I have a website that is challengeforall, all one word.com.
And that's the letter is in spelt for, or is it challenge for?
Spelt for.
Just checking, just check these things. Amazing. All right, Morgan, as I said, absolute pleasure. Thank you again. And
thank you so much. It's been lovely speaking with you. I love your insightful questions.
I try my best. It's just, I just say to people, I just get to sit here and ask questions, and just take everything in. So very, very much appreciative. And I know you've got to go and do, you're flipping now, aren't you? You're going to go and do,
another podcast.
Another podcast. We can name drop that one. What are you doing next, Morgan?
I'm a host for Teachers Talk Radio as well. So I'm about to do a podcast with Todd Brennan, our Friday lunch show, and it will be on questioning this week. So I'm going on to questioning.
Wow. Send my regards to Todd. I saw him at the Abu Dhabi Teaching Conference the other day. I didn't get to see his session, unfortunately, but a brief passing hello. But you see, you can plug this. We're fine. We love other podcasts. You kept that one quiet, didn't you? We will let you. You should say this when you go onto yours, by the way. You can just say, oh, by the way. No, I'm a joke. You can
name drop you like crazy.
Just throw it out there. Throw that one out there for us. All right, Morgan, as I say, wonderful. Enjoy. And we will let you go and rest that voice now. And thank you for sharing with us again. And we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thanks so much, Alex. Bye.